Today on the Men at the Movies podcast, we discuss how everything around us flavors our lives and how God has given us His Spirit to share with others. Join us as we discover God's truth in this movie.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being. Hello and welcome to the Men at the Movies podcast. My name is Paul McDonald, and joining me live in the studio is Patrick, Creehan, and Ricky Furr, back for more.
Hey. Appreciate the invite back, Paul. You apparently haven't learned your lesson yet.
The movie we're discussing this week, documentaries are movies. There is even an Oscar for it and all. We're doing a documentary called Neat. And neat, the definition of neat, is a liquor served at room temp and without any water, ice, or other mixture. It is pure. So, Patrick, since you were the one, you broke the seal on this. I mean, every time we met for probably weeks, if not months, multiple times. Yeah, have you seen Neat yet?
2 months minimum.
Until he broke us down and we watched it. And since then, I've probably seen it 3 or 4 times. So, Patrick, why did we pick this movie?
Oh, man. I think I wrote an actual review on this movie that's posted on one of the platforms out there. I don't know if it's on Google or something. I can't remember exactly where I wrote it, but it spoke to me. It's interesting to say that a documentary spoke to you in the same way that a lot of the movies that we end up talking about speak to you just on that deeper level. There's, just the elements that were in this documentary connected on, just the mastery and the artistry in not only the filmmaking, because it was a beautifully shot documentary. The cinematography was awesome. The storytelling was really cool. It kind of goes back and forth between what feels like a nature documentary where they're talking about the corn and the trees and stuff to a biopic about 6 or 7 different people that they follow through the thing to, an informational kind of documentary on how bourbon is actually made. But all woven throughout it is this story that they're telling about bourbon. In fact, that's part of the title is Neat, the story of bourbon from the beginning to the end, and all the various elements that go into crafting this spirit. And we all enjoy drinking bourbon, and it was just a really fun movie to watch, and I would encourage everybody to watch it, all the way to the end. And that's what I tell everybody who I encourage to watch this thing. Watch it all the way to the end, to the very last scene, and I guarantee you'll be in tears at the end.
Because what man doesn't want to be in tears at the end of an hour and 15-minute documentary?
Exactly. Yeah.
So we finally gave in to Patrick's harassment, and we watched it and immediately apologized for resisting him for so long.
Yeah, I actually took my iPad to work the next day, and the guy that sits next to me, I was like, hey, while you're working today, you're going to watch this. So, Patrick, please don't be mad to know that I could have watched it while I was at work the entire time that you were harassing us. But like you, Paul, I've probably watched it 3, 4, 7 times since then.
Yeah, I think Paul texted me after he watched it and said, I just watched Neat. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that it took me so long. And then Ricky texted and he said, how do I love bourbon more now?
Well, it was funny because my wife is not a bourbon drinker. And now she's like, okay, so those drinks that you make me before games, could you make them a little bit weaker so I get more of the bourbon out of it?
Oh, wow.
Absolutely. Yes, we can do this.
So now that we've alienated all of our alcoholic friends, our teetotaler friends, and we'll play a couple of clips because that's what we do here. But it starts off with these rolling fields and people talking about corn and oak because it's aged in barrels. We'll talk about all that. But there's a line that it said is it all goes into the making of the bourbon, the soil, the corn, the rye, the barley, the water, the oak. Everything about bourbon comes from the soil.
It's really important to take care of the soil and nourish the soil that's going to feed the plants that eventually go into bourbon. You know, corn grows for 4 months and it's pulling from the earth. The oak trees that eventually go into the barrels that are going to contain your product for 4 years have been drawing from the earth for upwards of 40, 50 years. Every season that is come and gone, every change in the environment, you'll eventually taste in a glass of bourbon. In a lot of ways, it's like drinking history and experiencing nature in a completely different way.
And not to make a huge spiritual jump here, but Jesus talked about soil and the importance of our soil. And he said our hearts were like soil. And some of it is hard pan. Some of it is choked by thorns and weeds. And some of it is stony ground. And some of it is good soil. And if you look throughout the Bible, it also says everything comes from the heart. Proverbs 4:23, guard your heart, for from it flows the springs of life. So everything comes from the heart. And then Jesus compared our hearts to soil. And as men, we're trying to cultivate our heart so that it's more of the good soil. It's less of that hard pan, less of the stony stuff, less of the stuff that's choked by the worries of the world, so that it is good soil, as Jesus says, that produces bumper crops, 30, 60, 100-fold yield.
What's amazing about that whole section in the documentary, I think it was Mariana Barnes, who is the first female master distiller since Prohibition, who was speaking about this, when she said that, you know, the corn will have been growing in its season for 4 months before it's harvested, and it's pulling up all the nutrients and flavors and things from the soil. And the white oak has been around for probably 40, 50, 70 years, pulling up the same kind of things from the soil where it's growing. And it's lived through seasons of lots of rain, droughts, you know, different seasons. And so you're literally, when you get the final product at the end, you're drinking history in a sense of these seasons. And what's amazing, to come back to your, you know, big jump into spiritual things about soil, is that in the same way, God takes these seasons that existed before we were even born, you know, he stitches together time and space and events and brings them together in this masterful way to produce the product, which is us, which we didn't have a whole lot of say in before we were here. And even during the course of our life, in the forming of our spirit, and bourbon is a spirit, the forming of our spirit, he takes these, whether
we're
it's
pulling
hard
out
clay,
all the stops.
Exactly. Whether it is hard soil, rocky soil, or really fertile, rich, deep, you know, peaty type soil, he uses it all to go in and collect the final product of this flavor, this masterful thing that he's put together that takes time to work in a only the master distiller can determine when it's right, when it's time, and all that goes in, and it's just a really cool thing. I don't think it's a huge leap either. I mean, we as believers watching this thing, we heard it, you know, the first time watching, we're like, oh man, that's so good.
Yeah, I think one thing I took from it was, you know, they're talking about the soul. Well, that's kind of the people that you put around you, and then all of a sudden, whenever you surround yourself with sages, the oak, that's whenever you actually start to mature, because you start to learn from their mistakes. After you surround yourself with the seasoning, the aging, then all of a sudden you become who you should be, who the bourbon was created to be.
If you come to this whiskey business in your early 20s, and with everything you know about making whiskey, you make the very best batch of whiskey you know how to make. Everything that you've learned, your family has been able to share, you make that batch of whiskey, you're going to release expressions of it. But when your last barrel from that batch reaches its maturity, you're now 45 years old. And that was your first batch. So you make another batch based on everything you learned from your first batch. By the time you go through that process again and your last barrel reaches its maturity, you're about 75 years old. In this industry, what most people don't realize, it is very, very rare that an old whiskey guy like us ever gets to taste their third batch to its final maturity. That's the legacy you leave for the next generation. You get to think about that, and you're thinking, I'm tasting what they didn't get a chance to taste.
Almost gives you cold chills.
Well, it's what you were just saying, Ricky, of how the sages that have come along, and I had never thought of it this way, of them being like the oak staves, and we'll talk about the oak and how the trees give the flavor to the spirit. But they are the sages that come in our lives. They're laying down the legacy, and that's the whole thing. You know, that the voice was from Freddie, who is a third generation employee of Buffalo Trace Distillery, and he talked about how his grandfather worked with Colonel Blanton, and then his father worked with Elmer T. Lee, and they created these bourbons, and they created these spirits through their knowledge and through wisdom. And the sages, what they do is they pass it down to us. And before this, Patrick was singing these songs from Hamilton, you know, as he's prone to do.
As one is wont to do.
As one does. You know, three guys hanging out. Somebody's going to bust out in Hamilton tunes.
Sorry, you guys. You had to be in the room where it happened.
But Hamilton talks about a legacy. A legacy is a seed that you plant in a garden you never get to see. And that's what Freddie was talking about. They never see their third batch because it takes so long to age properly. You know, it takes... And we'll talk about this, of the long process of maturation.
It kind of goes back to what, I don't know, we've talked about for the past 2 or 3 years as far as the ripple effect goes. You have no idea what you're laying down now. How it's going to affect generations from now. So, you know, I took that kind of correlation in with that, just like, and those distillers 70 years ago had no idea what they were going to be doing and what an impact Freddie was going to be doing to the people that were coming into the distillery just to talk to him.
Yeah.
Yeah. My mind immediately goes to, you know, us as parents, you know, and raising our kids and the work that we do, you know, before sending them out. We don't necessarily have a say in what happens after they leave our nest. Right. And so it's kind of that almost that third generation whiskey making thing. And so it just speaks to me about the importance of listening to those sages and elders and things who have gone through it before, have seen the impact of what their own parenting has done and things, and then trying to incorporate that just as a distiller would, and learning from those previous batches and from what was passed down to them and how he goes to, you know, into making his next batch.
Yeah, that's what I said.
So, as part of this, they talk about the ABCs of bourbon making. And the A is it has to be made in America. America. It's an A, not an M. America.
So I said the MBCs.
But it's interesting because location does have a huge impact on how bourbon is made, what gives it its flavor. You could fill it up there in Kentucky, which is where the majority of bourbon is made, at least when this was made. It's starting to spread all over the States now. But you could take a barrel and ship it out to Scotland, ship it out to China or Japan, which is another place where a lot of whiskey is made. And it would taste remarkably different because of the environment of Kentucky. And so the environment matters. It has to be from and the weird thing is a newly charred white oak barrel. So Patrick, why is it important that the oak barrel is newly charred?
So it has to be a new charred white oak barrel. So, and actually it doesn't even have to be a barrel. It can be any container, but just everybody uses barrels.
Yeah.
But the value of the char one is for the taste. So that's where you're going to get a lot of the color.
I don't taste charcoal.
You do. You do. You know, there's not a whole lot of ash.
Let me try again. Let me taste again. Maybe I'll taste some ash.
Right. Yeah. But the reason it has to be new is that it hasn't been kind of stained with the flavors of another alcoholic beverage that has been aged in it or anything else. In fact, one of the stories that is shared during the documentary about one of the theories of where bourbon came from was that it was a Lexington market, restaurateur or something who had decided to reuse some of the fish barrels that he used to make pickles or something. And so in order to get rid of the taste of all the pickles and fish that were in the barrel, he decided to char it, to cook it.
Because he didn't want his moonshine to taste like fish.
Right. And then after putting his, distillate in the newly charred barrel, it came out tasting like bourbon. That's where it came from. That's just one of the legends.
Delicious.
Yeah.
So, but why does that matter? Like, what is it about the char that gives it its flavor and its color?
It's that toasted flavor that you get when you cook something. It's that toast.
Yeah. Because what happens is in the summer, when things get hot, it expands. So the bourbon that's in the barrel actually goes into the wood through that charcoal. And charcoal filters. So it filters out the distasteful stuff, the bitter stuff. And then when it gets cold, it goes back through that and pulls out flavor from the oak barrel and filters again through the charcoal. And it does this for somewhere between like 4 and 20 years.
Right. Yeah. And cooking it too, they'll usually do a 2-stage cook on it. Like they'll do one initial toasting that'll bring a lot of the sugar to the surface of the wood. And then they'll do a second one where they then caramelize all that. And so that the burn is really the sugar. I mean, that's where a lot of that sweet, oaky taste comes from, is that
Reminds
sugar
me
on the
of
surface.
Toasted marshmallow.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. Yeah. So a lot of the aging, and they talk about this too, is that aging, and the reason that Kentucky is such a valuable place to make bourbon is because it has really cold winters and really hot summers.
So we've talked about the location. It's like we're shrinking. First, it's the location. It has to be done in America. Then it has to be done in this specific kind of barrel. And now we're talking about, well, what goes in the barrel? And it has to be made mostly of corn. And what they discovered is they would, especially in Kentucky, they'd have a lot of corn.
Well, it's because they would be taxed on their leftover corn. So they decided that they would make it into a spirit. That way, England didn't tax them for their extra corn. If we got that pissed off over tea, could you imagine how they would have got mad over their beverage?
He has seen Hamilton.
This isn't about Hamilton. So what's really cool is that, they're talking about, so they have all this leftover corn, after they're done eating and feeding their cattle and everything. And what do you do with all the leftover corn? And you're right. Like in the old world, the king would take whatever's left over. And now in America, they get to choose what they do with the leftover. And rather than throw it away and have it be waste, they preserve it. They make something that lasts with it by distilling it and turning it into this other thing, which is really cool. Even the leftover refuse turns into something that's almost more valuable than the original intended product.
Yeah, it was used as you get up in that morning and you're really, really sore, just something to help you get out of bed, get the soreness out. And well, now it's one of my favorite beverages.
So that was the C. And then the rest of them, it talks about the proof. It has to be how it comes off the still, which I think is another interesting concept. So they make it in this, they have this recipe of some mixture typically of corn, rye, and barley. And sometimes some places substitute wheat for the rye, and that makes it a little sweeter, just like wheat bread versus rye bread. So that's what they call their mash bill, and they mix it up and they throw yeast in there, and we're not getting into all the science. But after a while, it goes to the still. And what happens is they heat up the mixture. And what's alcohol, what is pure, what is the desired result, it boils off at a lower temperature. And I remember doing this when I was in chemistry class, of you boil something so that what the substance that burns lower will go up and you can extract it. And what you extract is pure, or at least purer. And you can do it. And they said most of the times they do at least a double distillate so that it's free of all the, not errors.
Impurities.
It's free of all the impurities. Thank you. I think that about us as well as, we talk about our spirits, and unfortunately they have to be heated. As we were just saying, enter your life, you will have trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul talks repeatedly about sufferings. I think it's Paul also talks about being in the refiner's fire and how the gold gets heated up because the gold melts at a lower temperature than the impurities that are in it. But it has to be heated, and none of us like the heat.
Yeah. What's cool about the bourbon making process, though, as opposed to like a vodka, which they talk about in the documentary as well, is that they pull it off the still at a lower proof than they do vodka. So vodka usually comes off at like 190 proof, which is like 95% alcohol. And you can almost not taste anything at 190 proof. It just tastes like pure ethanol. But at 160 or lower, which is what they pull the bourbon out on, that still keeps some of the flavor of the corn and the wheat or the rye. So you get a lot of that flavor, and that's what you're trying to keep, is that sweetness and that flavor. And what makes that specific mash bill, what makes that recipe special and that maker special is what goes into it. And he's trying to preserve that. Right. He's not trying to cook it all out.
There's a distillate proof, as he mentioned, it's lower, and then there's a proof at which you have to put it in the barrel, and then a fill proof, it has to be at least 80 proof. We don't want to, because otherwise it's like if you water down your Kool-Aid, it just doesn't taste right. But if you think about what goes in the barrel, because if you do everything the same, use the same yeast, the same corn, the same all this stuff, it would taste fairly similar, I would think. And the clear stuff that comes off the still is moonshine. Down here in NASCAR country, we're quite familiar with the shine.
White Dog, Georgia Moon.
But what makes bourbon different is it then goes into a barrel for a period of time to mature.
I believe that the maturation is really the magical part. It's the one part that you can't honestly control. It just happens how nature wants it to.
Bourbon takes time. You don't make it today and sell it tomorrow. You got to put it in the barrel, let nature take over. Hot summers, cold winters. You need both. Hot summers, the whiskey expands, goes into the wood. In the wintertime, when it gets cold, it contracts and comes out. That's where we get all the color and a lot of the flavor. So that's where you got to be patient. You got to leave it alone, put it away in the rack house, and let nature take over.
You can't control the seasons. You can't control how long the summer is or how hot it gets outside. The nature, the composition of the wood, from tree to tree, it's not going to be the same. From season to season, it's not going to be the same. So each individual barrel is going to have an individual character, and I think that's pretty magical. It's
remarkable that not only from one year to the next it's going to be different, but from one bottle to the next potentially, especially when distillers will do these small batches or single barrel or barrel pick type, offerings. You can't even guarantee that one bottle to the next is going to be the same. And in a world, in a quote unquote McDonald's type world where you want to ensure you're getting the same thing no matter where you order it, no matter what time you order it, kind of thing, like it's kind of a relief. It's kind of like a return to authenticity.
Yeah. And the other part of that I thought was interesting was this as she talks about, or as they talk about, and that was many of the distillers from the area, was the magic of maturation. All this goes into the barrel, and you can control almost everything. Like if they have a still, and they're typically made out of copper, and if they need to replace it, they will replace it. They will bring in a coppersmith to replace it down to the dents so that it is as replicatable, new word, as possible, because they want to control what comes off the still as much as they possibly can. And yet, and this is, you talked earlier about parenting, and I think that we look at our lives that same way. We want to control as much as we can, but there comes a point in our maturation process where we have to put it in the barrel. where we have to let it out of our control. And it goes in a barrel, and it goes into this house with hundreds, maybe thousands of other barrels to sit and wait for time. And the weather changes, the barrel changes. You know, we talked about a barrel is made up of 30 something staves, pieces of wood, planks that are curved to make the barrel. Well, each one of those staves brings us different flavor.
Yeah, it could come from a different tree.
Yeah. And each one works together to create, to impact what's the spirit that's in the barrel.
Yeah, I think if I remember right, it was 32 different staves that go into making a barrel, roughly. Well, if you look at all those as different tests, troubles, storms that come your way, that's different issues that come in your life that could shape your way with Christ. You know, are you going to embrace that, lean into him, gather his strength, or are you going to push away from him?
And some, as you compared the staves earlier to sages and people in our lives, some people may give us bitterness in response to trouble. Some may offer sweetness. Some offer a strength or a fire. You know, there's a peppery flavor to some bourbons. And I'm much more of a fan of the sweeter flavor, the smoother flavor. We've got some Blantons here just to shout that out. And it's like as you'll hear at the end, we bust out the best bottles for friends and family.
That's right.
We look at all this effort. I think that is a template for our lives. If we do put all this effort into, as we say, making the mash, making the white dog, the moonshine that goes into the barrel. And we do the best that we can with what we have. But there comes a point where we do have to, and you mentioned earlier, Patrick, in our conversation, there comes a point where we have to let our children go and realize that God has control. God is control of the seasons. God controlled the soil that went into the corn, that went into the bill, that went into the trees that have been growing for 70 years and finally been cut down and charred. And as much as we want to control, we can't control everything. I mean, we could try, but it wouldn't result in a good product.
No, I think the issue is whenever we try to control it, we ruin the product. You know, God has a vision for what we should have in our life. And whenever we try to overrun him and ruin ourselves, then we kind of ruin the drink.
Yeah. There's a certain extent to which God gives us the ability to do certain things and gives us ability to not control, but have influence over certain parts of how we live, the choices we make, and those kinds of things. And you see that reflected in things like picking the farm that the corn comes from, or, you know, they showed the one guy from Four Roses who smells every delivery of corn that comes in. And if it doesn't pass his sniff test, it doesn't come in, you know? And so there's things that we can do. Like, how do we spend our time? What do we ingest with our eyes? What do we read? You know, how do we, you know, decide to talk to people, or what jobs do we take? Where do we move? Like, all these decisions that we do make, we do have some control over, but to a large extent, a lot of how our life goes is up to the grace of God, you know, and there is a point at which the distillate goes in the barrel and we don't get to see it. There's some mysterious process that's taking place that we don't have eyes on or control over. But occasionally, if we're the distiller, which we're not necessarily in this analogy, but every year or so, the master distiller will get to go in and taste, okay, where is this barrel in the maturation process? Is it ready? Is it ready to be released?
You have to have patience. What we're producing today, it's not available till roughly 6.5, 7 years later. We're looking long range. We don't look at anything near term, because one thing we cannot do is buy time.
Bourbon cannot be rushed. It has to go in the warehouse. It has to age. People have tried to rush that process. That just can't be done.
I think there's a lot of parallels with how bourbon is made, how it's drank, how it's enjoyed, with maybe a lifestyle that we should be more pursuant of.
I think that follows in perfect to a few weeks ago. We were talking about the call on our lives and trying to rush that and not stopping to think, maybe I'm not ready for what God has actually called me to do. I think a lot of times we sit back and we try to think, okay, well, God has this on my heart. He must want me to do that now. Well, no, maybe he's putting that on my heart for me to work towards. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really good example of maybe there's a few more seasons we need to go through, a few more winters, a few more summers where I'm actually prepared for what he's got me, what he has envisioned for me.
And it's that passion and that vision that keeps us motivated during those cold winters when we're like, this doesn't look like how I thought it would. This is not turning out. We want to go crack open the barrel and say, this is as good as it's getting. But it takes a patience. And it's interesting. They talk about you try to rush the process because people would. And they talked about how they had to institute laws and regulations because people would take moonshine straight from the still.
They were putting tobacco spit in it just to give it the color.
Adding acid and all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
So that it felt like bourbon. It looked like bourbon.
Sure didn't taste like it.
Right. And that was actually hurting not just them or the people, they talked about rot gut, but it hurt the people who are doing it legitimately because how can we trust what you have when I can't trust what they have?
Yeah. So that's where bottled and bond came from. And the very first consumer protection law that was ever enacted in the United States was to protect bourbon, which is pretty funny, but totally awesome.
The only time the U.S. government did something good.
I think it was Colonel Taylor, wasn't it? Or I think it was Colonel Taylor who was championing that. It's really cool. And the documentary follows a few personalities and through the course of the movie. And one of them is this guy who's sort of an archaeologist and goes after, some of the old distillery sites that maybe had burned down.
Is not Harrison Ford.
Right. He is not. And it's kind of cool, just seeing the work that he puts into that deep excavation process and recovering what might have been lost in the history of bourbon. And the same kind of things are valuable too in our lives. Morgan talks about all the time this time that we need to spend in excavation of our soul and kind of recovering what was lost and digging down deep and finding those. They got so excited because they found a little burnt piece of corn in the ground, and just finding those little puzzle pieces or those little nuggets, that are left in the course of our lives that can help point us back to the history and where things came from and how things came to be to where we are now and forming who we are. Really cool. And then the other guy who created the speakeasy in his basement was really passionate about bourbon and just uses bourbon as a place to build community and fellowship with people, and how this spirit and the passion that he has can be transferred and delight and excite and bring together people around this, this spirit, which is really cool.
Well, and one of the other stories was about this guy who had been in a car wreck and was pretty debilitated afterwards and began working with used bourbon barrels because, as we mentioned, only new barrels can be used for bourbon. So if it's used for bourbon once, it can't be used again for bourbon.
Yeah, the majority of the bourbon barrels end up getting shipped off for scotch.
Yeah. Another fine beverage.
Or wine. They're making a lot of wine out of in bourbon barrels now too, which is delicious.
And some coffee beans. My wife got me bourbon barrel coffee beans for Christmas.
Nice.
I love that.
But he talks about how he was broken, and he mentioned one of his girlfriends looked at his hand and he's like, you'll never be able to do anything with that. You'll never be able to work with your hands again. When we look back at the maturation process and what we go through, we get a glimpse of what it is we're called to do.
My life needed fixing, and this is what repaired me, was woodworking. I was broken, and these things were broken too, and now I'm putting them together in their new form, and now they're beautiful again.
Like, we're called to make beautiful things out of, and it's not like, Ricky, you're called to make beautiful things. You did a great job with your kitchen last week. That is something that Patrick and I would be paying somebody to do,
Yeah.
but you were able to do on your own. I'm able to do stuff that can make beautiful things, and Patrick can do stuff to make beautiful things, and they're all different. And just like every barrel of bourbon is different, because every barrel of bourbon, it's made up of different things. We've all had different influences on our lives. We've all had different barrel staves giving flavor to the spirit within us.
God, that's really good. That is stupid good.
But at the same time, we're all called to add life. We're all called, and you look in the Bible, and yeah, it's not bourbon, but it's wine. And wine, when you see wine, it's about the spirit. It's about joy. It's about life that comes into our lives, the light that Jesus brings through us, through the Spirit.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the Spirit leads us to do different things. I'm not called to do the same things that you are. I'm not called to do the same things that Patrick's are.
Patrick has 4 boys, which you and I are both very happy we do not.
Oh, I've told him several times I could not handle that. I still have yet to figure out how you and Megan do it.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can talk about that offline.
God entrusted me with 1. He entrusted him with 4.
Yeah.
The thing I love about the story of the guy who lost use of his hand and then made all that beautiful furniture from the bourbon barrels is, yet again, it's another instance of taking what was thrown away or discarded and making something valuable out of it. And not only the bourbon barrel, which has to be discarded, as we talked about, he's making furniture, but he was discarded, saying you can't do anything with your life. And now he's using really his weakness and the strength that he gained in his other hand and with his mind and with his creativity to produce this furniture. And he's using it he's building a relationship with his son-in-law and teaching him this craft and things. And it was just a really beautiful picture, just like we heard about the corn being discarded, because what are you going to do with all this extra corn? We're not going to give it to the king, so let's make bourbon out of it. It's another instance of that, using what's discarded by the world to produce something beautiful.
Well, I mean, you have Moses, he's at the burning bush and he's sitting there and he's arguing with God and he's like, I'm not eloquent with my words. And he's like, just go talk to the Pharaoh. I've got your back. And he literally used his weakness to show God's strength. So, I mean, it's the exact same principle.
And what you were talking about, Ricky, is from 2 Corinthians, where Paul's talking about how he kept asking about the thorn in the flesh. Take it away, take it away. And Jesus said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Because we act a lot of times like the grace of God is sufficient to save us from our sins. And it is. I'm not saying it's not. That'd be heresy. But then we act like, okay, Jesus, I'm saved from my sins. I'm redeemed. I'm justified. And now it's up to me. And we act like our maturation, we act like our growth, our, to use another Bible word, sanctification, is up to us. And it's based on our effort, our work, our achievements. But every day, we are just as dependent on the grace of God as we are the day that we came to know Christ, the day that we were saved, the day that we repented and turned to him and we found forgiveness of our sins. Because, by the way, forgiveness of sins is a one-time thing. It forgave all our sins in the past and every sin we would do in the future. We're already forgiven because time and space and all this other stuff that we're not going to talk about today. But
that's for the Interstellar.
I was thinking Inception. We look at, I am weak. I'm not good enough. I didn't do enough. What is God going to say when I stand before the throne and he judges me? Well, we know what he's going to say. He's going to say, Jesus took it. Welcome home. well done, my faithful servant, because you did what I asked you to do. You followed me. You loved God and you loved your neighbor. And our maturation, our growth, our, again, sanctification is just as dependent on God every day as our justification and our forgiveness of sins. Just like the spirit in the barrel, just like the bourbon, it depends on the weather. It depends on the oak, that depends on the soil that it grew in for 70 years. And we think it's up to us, but it's not. And instead of putting pressure on ourselves, which we do, put pressure on ourselves to father our kids, husband our wives, accomplish these visions and dreams and goals that God has given us to go places and do things, mighty works in his name. And what he says is, be weak and let me do it. Put the bourbon in the barrel and let me do my job.
Yeah. I don't know if he says be weak, but I think it's more of rely on my strength.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's amazing is what happens in that barrel. We talked about the sloshing in and out of the wood, but what also happens after you leave the whiskey in the barrel for a long time is that some of it evaporates. And the part that evaporates, the angel share, is the part that's the same between every other barrel, right? It's the alcohol, it's the water. That's what's evaporating and seeping out through the barrel. And what's remaining in there is everything that made it unique. The flavor that came from that in and out of the barrel, the flavor of the wheat, the flavor of the rye, whatever it was that made that one unique, that unique kind of special recipe. And all of the weather and all of the heat and the cold and all of that is what remains.
Because even if the barrels were made of exactly the same trees and exactly the same staves, where they are in the house will change, because this one might be a little more protected from the weather. This one might get a little more sun. This one might be on the edge. This one might be a little more tolerant. It ends up different. It all matters. And I think what we do a lot of times, instead of, as the kid in the feeding of the 5,000 is say, I have these loaves and fish, we beat ourselves up because it's like, oh man, I should have brought more food. I know I feel that way. Oh, I should have done things different because I didn't prepare for the situation that I'm facing today. But thankfully, we have friends like each other. Mm-hmm. I have Patrick and Ricky, and we can sit down and we can talk about these situations and these struggles and these frustrations like we did for an hour and a half before we got on this recording.
And drink some Noah's Mill and Willet and Blanton's and Old Forester.
We didn't make it to the Eagle Rare and the Buffalo Trace.
Next time.
Because it's important to spend time with your friends and family, with, as Dan Allender said, with those like-hearted kings. The three of us are like-hearted kings. We desire the same things.
Because that spirit, like the reason that we have the spirits that we do is to bring together people. He gave us our spirit for two purposes: to love him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and
all
to love
the things.
Yeah, and to love each other, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And it's those connections that we form through our lives with every person that we encounter, and especially those closest to us, that is the reason that he gave us the spirit that we have. And you don't want to waste it.
When Dad rolled out the 6 millionth barrel, Julian Van Winkle gave me, as a gift to my dad, this bottle of 20-year-old Pappy. So I take the bottle and I open it up and I pour a little bit in his glass, pour a little bit in my brother's glass, pour some in my glass, and I go to put the stopper back in the bottle. And he looks at me and he gives me this weird look and he says, "What on earth are you doing?" I said, "Dad, I don't understand." I said, "This is a really, really good bottle of bourbon." I said, "It's really being sought after." He said, "I'm aware of that." I said, "So what I'm thinking is I'm just saving it so that we can do some more toast later on." He says, "Never, ever do that with friends and family. there will always be more old barrels of bourbon being made. He says, look at me and look at your brother. He says, we're the fragile part of this whole thing. He said, so never ever save old bottles of bourbon, okay? They're meant to be enjoyed with friends and family at the moment. It was the first time that my father and my brother and I had spent 3 hours together, just us, talking, laughing, discussing things that we had done that we didn't think he knew we had done. And then we started telling him about things that he had done that he didn't know that we knew he had done. We had the best time. We finished the bottle. 9 months later, they were both gone.
We're the fragile parts of this. That hits hard. Both of you have already graced the 40-year mark, and
he said we're old.
And I'm quickly approaching that 40-year mark. And the 20 years of construction have finally started to catch up with me, and I'm starting to get sore when I get up in the morning. The kitchen remodel that you're praising me for honestly got the best of me, and Saturday we didn't get as much done because I was down for the count. And it's, are we actually going to stop and listen to what God's calling us to do? If God prompts us to talk to that person, are we going to stop and do it? If we're too busy to spend every Tuesday night with a couple buddies just catching up, making sure that our hearts are good, our heads are good, are we actually going to take that time? That's the part, if you haven't watched it yet, make sure you have a tissue for, because if you listen to the meaning behind his words, it's heavy.
Yeah, I've heard it said that nobody ever says on their deathbed, I wish I spent more time at work. It's that whole same idea of like, let's step back and see what is really valuable. Like what should we really be paying attention to here? And it's not the 23-year bottle of Pappy that's really important here, although that's super special. But what makes it special, and I have a friend, a neighbor who has a bottle of 23-year Pappy Family Reserve, which is like the rarest, most special bottle that you can imagine. And he texted me not long ago and said, hey, I think it's about time to sell this, and said, I think I can get some money for it. It'd be good to have. Honestly, on the secondary market, you can get a few $1,000s,
which would be highly illegal, just to waive any claims that we're subscribing to any illegal activity here.
Right.
On the
not that he
podcast.
would. I'm just saying that I have seen that it happened before, that bottle has gone for several $1,000s. And he was wondering if now was the time for him to, get rid of it. And I had recently watched Neat, and I replied to him. I said, have you watched Neat yet? and he said no. And I said, listen to me, that however much money you would get from that bottle is not going to last as long as the memory of you opening it and sharing it with your boys or with your friends or whoever, right?
Like your neighbor, Patrick.
Yes, or your neighbor. Feel free to spend that on me. Yeah, because I mean that's really what it's about, is those memories and the relationships and the special times that it brings together. And just like Freddie said, we're not guaranteed tomorrow. And what good is it to keep around a bottle of bourbon in your cabinet if it's just gonna sit there, and the people who it was meant to bring together and for you to love and cherish are going to go away.
Which I want to take this time to say, we're not okaying for somebody to go buy a bottle of bourbon at the ABC store or at State Line or wherever you buy your beverages at and get completely wasted on it. But slow down. Take the time to see what God has actually placed around you. Your wife, your husband, your boys, your girls, your friends. Like, I think right now, the way that the world's going, everything is so instant, so fast. And if we don't get what we want right then, we're mad. I literally have an Amazon distribution center 15 minutes from my house. I can order something that morning and it's delivered at my house whenever I get home from work. That's ridiculous. Slow down and actually enjoy what God's actually placed around you. He's placed these people, these foundations, these sages, these mentors, these elders around you. Exactly. For a reason. Soak that in, because, you know, as I was telling you guys 2 hours ago, I literally attended a funeral of a 29-year-old that appeared to be in perfect health. And, you know, he's left behind a wife and 3 kids. We're not promised tomorrow. Enjoy what you have. Make those memories, because if I'm not here tomorrow, I damn well want to make sure that my wife and my daughter know exactly who I was, what I stood for, and what I loved. I want to make sure that they know that I love them.
We've been entrusted with the Spirit, but not to keep it to ourselves, but to share it with others. And whatever that looks like, that might look like literally sharing a spirit with 2 of your brothers. That might look like showing kindness to the person in the street. That might look like making something beautiful out of what the world says is broken. But we have this spirit that we've been given as a gift. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to share it? We are like a city set on a hill. We are a light. You don't hide a light under a bushel.
No.
You put it on a lampstand. You share it for everyone to see. So how do we take this spirit that we've been given? And I'm not talking about bourbon right now. How do we take this spirit, this life that God has given us, and share it with a world in need of that, in need of a pause, in need of seeing things for the first time, seeing things how they are? And that's our role as Christians, is to share the Spirit of God. You know, as they say, St. Francis said, preach at all times, and when necessary, use words. You know, how do we show our children? You know, Patrick was asking, how do we teach his boys how to respect and how to treat and love the women around him? And I said, you can tell them all you want, but you show them every day by the way you treat your wife. And it's the same thing, you know, for us with daughters. And how do we change the world around us? It's by living in it and sharing the Spirit of God in whatever way that might be. And that is both the enjoyment of the Spirit as well as the maturation process. So this has been the Men at the Movies podcast with Paul McDonald, Patrick Creehan, and Ricky Furr.
Tune in again next week. We'll be back. Follow us on iTunes, Google Play, and anywhere you get your podcasts. And from us at Men in the Movies, cheers.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?